280,000 jobs erased, more than $52 billion wiped from a single state economy, and an entire winter tourism system hollowed out in less than 2 years. Not by a hurricane, not by a pandemic, but by a trade war-driven political rupture between the United States and Canada. This is not a local Florida story. It is a national warning. What began as hostile rhetoric, tariff threats, and diplomatic disregard has escalated into one of the most severe tourism collapses in modern American history. This trade war did not stop at factories or ports. It moved directly into consumer behavior, turning tourism into an economic weapon and trust into collateral damage. Canada did not announce sanctions. Canadians simply stopped coming. And here is the part that most policymakers in the United States still do not fully understand. This collapse is not cyclical, and it is not reversible. By the end of this analysis, you will hear one detail that has never been openly discussed, a structural shift that suggests Florida may never recover what it lost, even if politics change. In the 12 months following the escalation of the trade war between the United States and Canada, Florida experienced one of the sharpest demand withdrawals ever recorded in a developed tourism economy. Open-source tourism data, airline capacity reports, and state-level labor estimates all point to the same conclusion. The Canadian exit was sudden, synchronized, and devastating. Canadian visitors once injected between $38 billion and $42 billion into Florida every year. Within a single winter season, that flow collapsed by more than half. In several snowbird-dependent counties, peak winter occupancy fell by over 40% compared to historical averages. Some coastal municipalities reported vacancy rates not seen since the financial crisis, despite aggressive price cuts and tax incentives. The employment shock followed immediately. By conservative estimates, 280,000 tourism-related jobs disappeared across Florida, including hotel staff, restaurant workers, healthcare support services, maintenance crews, real estate agents, and seasonal contractors. Internal labor models suggest a true figure may exceed 310,000 once indirect losses are included. These were not temporary furloughs. These were permanent exits from the workforce. What triggered the breaking point was not one policy, but a convergence. Tariff threats targeting Canadian aluminum, lumber, and agriculture coincided with increasingly confrontational political rhetoric. When Canada was publicly framed as economically subordinate, the message landed with force. Canadian media amplified it. Retirement associations debated it, consumer groups acted on it, then border anxiety accelerated everything. Reports of heightened screenings, entry denials, and enforcement activity near tourist corridors spread rapidly through Canadian networks. Whether statistically rare or not, the perception was decisive. For retirees, uncertainty became unacceptable. Tourism shifted from leisure to liability. Airline data confirms the structural nature of the break. Canadian carriers cut winter capacity to Florida by double-digit percentages and redirected aircraft to Europe, Mexico, and Asia. Those routes filled. Florida routes did not recover. This was not delayed demand, it was replaced demand. Florida officials initially blamed inflation and media exaggeration, but local budgets told a harsher truth. Tourist tax revenues collapsed by as much as 50% in some jurisdictions. Infrastructure projects were frozen. School districts cut programs. Emergency reserves were drained at record speed. This was the moment the illusion ended. Florida was not experiencing a downturn. It was confronting the consequences of a trade war that transformed consumer trust into a strategic fault line. And what comes next is even more unsettling because buried inside provincial Canadian data is a shift that suggests this boycott was not emotional at all, but calculated, and the next section reveals why the money did not disappear, but moved in a way that may permanently lock the United States out. What makes this collapse far more severe than officials initially admitted is a simple fact that cannot be spun away. The money did not vanish. It relocated. As Canadian travel to the United States contracted, domestic and outbound spending patterns inside Canada shifted with extraordinary speed. Open-source banking flow estimates, airline scheduling data, and provincial tourism disclosures indicate that between $27 billion and $30 billion per year, that once flowed into Florida was redirected elsewhere within 18 months. This redirection occurred without government mandates, subsidies, or emergency decrees. It was driven entirely by consumer choice. Canadian provinces absorbed the first wave. Winter occupancy rates in Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Atlantic Canada rose sharply, with some regions reporting double-digit growth in off-season economic activity. Retirement-oriented housing developments expanded. Healthcare utilization stabilized. Local service employment increased. Provincial tax receipts linked to domestic travel climbed at a pace not seen in decades. What Florida lost became internal Canadian circulation, multiplying through wages, municipal services, and public investment. International redirection followed immediately. Canadian Airlines reduced Florida-bound winter seat capacity by more than 30%, while expanding routes to Europe, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Asia-Pacific destinations. Load factors on non-United States routes reached record highs, even as Florida flights struggled to fill discounted seats. This behavior signals something critical. Demand was not waiting, it was replacing. Financial markets confirmed the shift. Canadian banks and pension funds quietly reduced exposure to United States tourism-dependent real estate while increasing allocations toward domestic hospitality, infrastructure, and politically neutral jurisdictions. In several Florida counties, foreign-owned property listings surged by more than 70% as Canadian owners chose liquidation over return. Property prices softened, local tax bases eroded, and municipal revenue projections were revised downward across multiple fiscal years. For Florida workers, the consequences were immediate and personal. Service sector wages stagnated as labor demand collapsed. Healthcare access declined as private clinics closed. Working-age residents began leaving the state altogether, accelerating population churn and weakening consumer demand even further. What began as a tourism shock evolved into a labor market crisis. The most damaging element is permanence. Surveys conducted across multiple Canadian provinces show that a majority of former snowbirds no longer view travel to the United States as neutral or predictable. Even among those who cite affordability or weather as motivators, trust has not returned. Once a consumer reorganizes life, healthcare, housing, and social networks around a new pattern, reversal becomes unlikely. This is the silent cost of the trade war. It did not merely disrupt exports or supply chains. It severed a consumer relationship that took generations to build and months to dismantle. The next section exposes why this shift was not accidental, emotional, or temporary, but part of a deeper strategic realignment that many in Washington still refuse to acknowledge, including one internal indicator that suggests the door may already be closed. That mismatch explains why the United States failed to anticipate the scale of damage now unfolding across Florida and other tourism-dependent regions. Policymakers focused on factories, ports, and export balances, while ignoring a far larger vulnerability: services, consumer trust, and allied behavior. Tourism was classified as discretionary, apolitical, and resilient. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. In reality, Canadian travel to the United States functioned as a form of soft capital. It stabilized local labor markets, smoothed municipal budgets, supported private healthcare systems, and inflated real estate valuations. When that capital withdrew, there was no federal backstop. No emergency lending facility exists for lost goodwill. No stimulus can replace millions of individual decisions not to cross a border. The miscalculation deepened as border enforcement practices intensified. Even without formal policy changes, the perception of unpredictability became dominant. Reports of secondary screenings, device inspections, and entry denials circulated widely in Canada, magnified by social media and mainstream coverage, for retirees managing healthcare schedules, property ownership, and fixed incomes. Perceived risk outweighed any discount or incentive. Tourism demand collapsed not because of price, but because of uncertainty. The economic feedback loop accelerated. As Canadian visitors disappeared, Florida cut services. As services declined, quality fell. As quality fell, remaining visitors spent less and stayed shorter periods. Businesses responded by closing or reducing hours, further degrading the experience. This self-reinforcing spiral exposed how dependent the state had become on a single foreign demographic whose loyalty was never guaranteed. International observers took note. Allied governments and multinational investors began reassessing exposure to United States regions whose growth models rely on political stability and foreign goodwill. The lesson was unmistakable. If Canada disengaged quietly and effectively, any partner can. Tourism, investment, and consumption have become instruments of geopolitical alignment, whether Washington recognizes it or not. Canada's response highlighted the contrast. There were no dramatic announcements, no retaliatory legislation, no trade embargoes. Canadians simply changed behavior. Domestic tourism expanded. International diversification accelerated. Capital was redeployed. The outcome favored resilience over dependence. What Florida experienced as collapse, Canada experienced as consolidation. This is where the damage becomes truly strategic. The United States did not lose market share to a rival, it lost it to absence. And absence is harder to counter than competition because it leaves nothing to negotiate with. One internal metric now circulating among regional planners reveals just how final this shift may be, a figure that suggests the window for recovery has already closed. Regardless of future elections or policy reversals, Florida is now confronting a reality that few state-level economies are prepared to face, a permanent demand hole with no recovery lever. Internal planning models used by regional development agencies indicate that even under the most optimistic assumptions, no more than 30% of former Canadian winter spending is projected to return over the next decade. That implies a structural loss of roughly 35 to 40 billion in annual economic activity. This is not a recessionary dip. It is a reset. The scale is comparable to the long-term decline of a major industrial sector, except this collapse did not originate from global competition or automation. It originated from political miscalculation. Florida's growth model magnified the damage. For years, the state optimized around foreign seasonal capital rather than productivity gains. Municipal budgets expanded on the assumption of stable tourist taxes. Real estate valuations inflated on the assumption of endless foreign buyers. Labor markets adjusted to seasonal abundance rather than year-round resilience. When Canadian money exited, there was no alternative engine ready to replace it. The fiscal consequences are compounding. Property tax shortfalls are forcing counties to raise rates on remaining residents, accelerating affordability crises. School districts face chronic underfunding as tourism-linked revenues fail to recover. Infrastructure maintenance is deferred, not delayed. Deferred maintenance becomes decay. Decay drives further out migration. The feedback loop tightens. At the household level, the effects are already visible. Former service workers are leaving the state entirely in search of stability. Businesses that survived the initial shock now face labor shortages and declining demand simultaneously. Wages stagnate while living costs rise. This is how localized economic collapse becomes demographic shift. What makes reversal unlikely is behavioral entrenchment. Former snowbirds have reorganized healthcare access, housing arrangements, and social networks elsewhere. Canadian retirees now winter domestically or internationally in jurisdictions perceived as politically neutral and administratively predictable. Once those systems are in place, the incentive to return weakens dramatically, even if relations improve. No advertising campaign can rebuild trust. No tax incentive can undo years of accumulated perception. The trade war did not merely change prices, it changed identity. Tourism to the United States is no longer framed as leisure in Canadian public consciousness. It is framed as a choice with political meaning. This is the cost Washington failed to calculate. The United States did not just lose visitors. It lost a generation of loyal consumers who required no subsidies, no marketing, and no coercion, only respect. One final data point, quietly acknowledged in closed-door discussions but never publicly addressed, reveals just how deep this rupture runs. It shows that the Canadian withdrawal has already altered long-term population and investment projections for multiple Florida counties in a way that cannot be statistically reversed. That figure will be addressed in the final segment, and it explains why this episode may mark the end of an era, not a pause. Buried deep inside regional planning forecasts is the number that explains why this rupture may already be permanent. Population and capital flow models used by multiple Florida metropolitan planning organizations now assume a long-term annual population shortfall exceeding 160,000 seasonal residents, driven almost entirely by the disappearance of Canadian snowbirds. This is not a temporary variance. It is baked into projections extending more than 15 years forward. Once those assumptions were revised, everything else followed. School enrollment forecasts were cut, healthcare capacity expansion plans were shelved, transportation demand models were downgraded, real estate development pipelines were quietly canceled. In several coastal counties, projected housing demand for retirees was revised downward by more than 40%. These adjustments were not ideological, they were mathematical. What makes this indicator so revealing is what it represents. Planners no longer expect Canadians to return in meaningful numbers regardless of election cycles, policy shifts, or diplomatic resets. The models assume behavioral permanence. That assumption alone reshapes how billions of dollars in public and private investment are allocated. For the United States, this marks a strategic failure that extends far beyond Florida. The trade war did not merely provoke retaliation. It demonstrated that allies can disengage silently without confrontation and inflict lasting economic damage through absence alone. No tariffs were imposed. No borders were closed. Consumers simply chose not to participate. For Canada, the outcome is clarity. Capital stays home. Spending circulates domestically. Dependence has been replaced by optionality. The snowbird era, once framed as cultural tradition, is now viewed as economic leakage that no longer makes sense in a volatile geopolitical environment. This is the lesson Washington has yet to fully confront. Power in a globalized economy is no longer exercised only through production or force. It is exercised through trust, predictability, and respect. When those collapse, markets do not protest, they withdraw. Florida did not lose its winter economy because Canadians were angry. It lost it because Canadians recalculated and found that the United States no longer fit their risk tolerance. The trade war was supposed to strengthen American leverage. Instead, it revealed how much of the United States economy rests on invisible relationships that can vanish without warning, and that is the real shock few are willing to say out loud. This was not economic warfare from abroad. It was self-inflicted damage, and the bill is still arriving. Is this a bold strategy or a costly miscalculation for the United States in an era where allies can simply walk away? Subscribe for more fact-based global trade analysis. Thanks for watching.